Something shifted in the global payments infrastructure on March 17, 2025, and the world missed the signal. While financial media was fixated on Bitcoin ETF headlines and macro noise, two separate events happened on the same day that, when you put them side by side, tell a story that has not been explained to retail investors the way it should be. Ripple announced a full institutional expansion into Brazil, payments, custody, prime brokerage, treasury, the entire financial stack. And on that exact same day, MasterCard announced its intent to acquire BVNK, one of the most sophisticated stable coin payment infrastructure companies in the world. What I'm about to tell you is not being discussed in mainstream financial media, because the conversation most people are having is about the price. The conversation you should be having is about the architecture. Let me pull back the curtain. Welcome back. In this briefing, we don't chase candles. We examine structure. Today, we decode what these two announcements, in combination, reveal about where institutional capital is actually moving, what it means for XRP's role in the global financial system, and why the math behind it points to something most retail investors haven't calculated yet. Let's get into it. Let's start with the hard truth. The majority of people watching XRP are staring at a price chart. They're asking the wrong question. The question is not when does the price move. The question is, when does the infrastructure become impossible to ignore? And that distinction between price watching and infrastructure watching is precisely what separates the retail crowd from the institutional architects quietly building the new financial system. Here's what you need to understand about Brazil. This is not a test market. Brazil is the 9th largest economy on the planet. It processes hundreds of billions of dollars in cross-border payments annually. It has one of the most forward-thinking central banks in the world, already operating a real-time payments network, PAX, that processes over 180 million transactions per month. When Ripple plans its entire product suite, not just one product, the entire stack, in that market, that is not a marketing move. That is a permanent installation. Think about what Ripple just deployed there. Ripple Payments, the cross-border rails. Ripple Custody, the institutional-grade asset storage. Ripple Treasury, formerly known as G-Treasury, a platform already connected to approximately 13,000 banks globally. And Relust, their regulated stablecoin, now carrying over $1.5 billion in market capitalization. One provider, one integrated system, every layer of the financial stack, live in one of the world's most dynamic financial markets. And critically, Ripple has applied for a virtual asset service provider license with the Central Bank of Brazil. That is a compliance-first move. That is not a company hedging its bets. That is a company telling regulators, we are here permanently, and we are playing by your rules. To understand why this matters structurally, you need to understand the concept of network liquidity requirements. The more markets Ripple is licensed and active in, the more payment corridors are live, the more XRP is required to function as a bridge currency, facilitating real-time conversion between fiat rails that would otherwise require pre-funded Nostro accounts sitting idle. According to available estimates, approximately $27 trillion in capital is locked globally in Nostro and Vostro accounts at any given time. Dead capital, generating no return, existing solely to lubricate the outdated correspondent banking system. XRP is engineered to dissolve that inefficiency, and Brazil is the latest market where that dissolution just went institutional. Let's do the math that the retail crowd is not doing. Cross-border payment volume globally runs at approximately $150 trillion annually. The foreign exchange market alone turns over roughly $7.5 trillion every single day. That is the market that XRP's on-demand liquidity model is designed to serve. Now think about this logically. XRP has a fixed total supply of 100 billion tokens. Of that, approximately 55 to 57 billion are in circulation at any given time. The remaining balance is held in escrow, with roughly 1 billion released monthly, and the majority of that is relocked by Ripple. The circulating supply is not expanding meaningfully. It is structurally constrained. Here is the mathematical pressure point. If you want to move, say, $1 million across a payment corridor using XRP as the bridge currency at its current price level, you require a certain number of tokens to be liquid at that moment. As the price per token increases, the number of tokens required to facilitate that same transaction decreases. This is not a speculative concept. This is a liquidity efficiency requirement. The network functions more efficiently at a higher price point. That is not opinion. That is the design architecture of the system. Now overlay Brazil. Overlay the 60-plus active markets Ripple operates in. Overlay $100 billion already processed through Ripple payments. And then ask yourself, what happens to the demand pressure on a fixed supply, utility-driven token as the payment volume scales? The math doesn't lie. And this isn't a Moonboy calculation. This is the logical infrastructure requirement of a payment network operating at scale. Now here's the layer that almost nobody talked about on March 17th. The same day Ripple announced the Brazil expansion, MasterCard announced its intent to acquire BVNK Finance, a fintech company specializing in enterprise-grade stable coin payment infrastructure, founded in 2021, headquartered in San Francisco, the same city as Ripple. Their stated mission: to accelerate global money movement by bridging traditional fiat systems, blockchains, and stablecoins. On BVNK's official website, they published a detailed analysis of Ripple versus SWIFT across 6 key categories of international business payments. The piece covers transaction speed, cost efficiency, intermediary reduction, and interoperability. And in the pros column for Ripple, they specifically cite XRP's function as a bridge currency enabling streamlined liquidity, cross-border settlement in seconds, not days, at a fraction of the cost. This is a company that MasterCard just agreed to acquire. And on their own public-facing website, they are making the case for why XRP is architecturally superior to SWIFT for cross-border payments. That is not an accident. That is signal. Ask yourself this brutal question. Does a company with MasterCard's legal infrastructure and institutional reputation move to acquire a firm without performing exhaustive due diligence on every technology, every partner relationship, every public statement that firm has ever made? MasterCard does not gamble. They position. And BVNK's public positioning, which MasterCard reviewed before agreeing to this acquisition, is explicitly favorable toward Ripple and XRP's payment architecture. We also know from last week that MasterCard formally partnered with Ripple alongside several other blockchain infrastructure providers. So you now have the world's second largest payment network partnered with Ripple and simultaneously acquiring a company whose official technical literature endorses XRP over SWIFT. Connect the dots. This isn't retail FOMO. This is calculated institutional architecture being quietly assembled while the crowd debates chart patterns. We've also seen the Brazil Central Bank, one of the most technologically progressive central banks in the world, accept Ripple's VSB license application. Meanwhile, in the United States, the regulatory environment has structurally shifted. The SEC is now led by Paul Atkins. The CFTC and SEC are actively collaborating on digital asset classification frameworks. The years of regulatory warfare that BVNK itself cited as a challenge for Ripple's adoption, that era is closing. The gate that was deliberately held shut is now opening. Think about what David Schwartz and Brad Garlinghouse have been executing on quietly for the past several years. Not press releases, not Twitter noise, but licensing, compliance frameworks, acquisitions, and infrastructure deployment across 60-plus markets. The architecture isn't coming. It's already built. Brazil is not the beginning. Brazil is the latest chapter. And Unrealistic, Ripple's own regulated stablecoin, now exceeds $1.5 billion in market capitalization. The point that the on-chain community made clearly is worth stating here. Stablecoins and XRP are not competitors. They are complementary instruments on the same network. Unrealistic settling on the XRP ledger, using XRP as a bridge on the decentralized exchange, creates compounding utility. The more stable coins issued on the XRPL, the more XRP-driven bridging activity on the DEX. This is a multiplier, not a dilution. The regulatory clarity catalyst is no longer a future event. It is an active process. The Digital Asset Clarity Act framework is in motion. The SEC under new leadership has already signaled a pivot from enforcement first to rules of the road. Ripple's own legal resolution has cleared the most significant overhang that kept institutional gates closed. What happens when that final switch is flipped? When the risk premium associated with regulatory ambiguity is removed from XRP's price. Institutional capital doesn't trickle in. It flows through pre-built pipelines. The exact pipelines Ripple has been constructing for the past decade across 60 markets, 100 plus banking partners, and now the 9th largest economy on the planet. The VSP license application in Brazil has a timeline. The MasterCard BVNK acquisition has a closing timeline. ETF frameworks for XRP are actively in development across multiple jurisdictions. When the regulatory catalysts arrive, the wait-and-see money becomes all-in money. And there will be no announcement. There will be no warning candle. There will simply be a new price reality. We are moving from an era of abundance to an era of structural scarcity. Exchange reserves for XRP have been trending downward as tokens move into custody solutions, including institutional-grade custody products like Ripple Custody itself. When a token enters a multi-signature institutional vault managed under a regulated custody framework, it does not come back to the open market for a 10% profit. It is locked. It has gone from the liquid supply for months or years. The 7.7 million XRP holders that exist today represent a fraction of the total addressable market that will exist when Ripple's payment rails are fully normalized across 60-plus live markets, when BVNK's infrastructure is operating under MasterCard's network, and when institutional treasury managers, not retail traders, become the primary demand driver. The crowd that spent the last 3 years confused about regulatory timelines, frustrated by price consolidation, and distracted by other narratives. That crowd is the exit liquidity of the uninformed funding the entry position of those who understood the architecture. The window to accumulate at current levels is not infinite. The infrastructure is being finalized now. The licensing is being issued now. The acquisitions are happening now. I know it is not easy to hold conviction when price is consolidating and the headlines create noise. I understand that. But as an analyst, I am trained to distinguish between noise and signal. Being early feels exactly like being wrong, right up until the moment the structural reality catches up to the price. Here's the signal. Ripple just deployed a full institutional stack in Brazil. MasterCard is acquiring a company whose public literature endorses XRP over SWIFT. The regulatory overhang of the Gensler era is structurally behind us. Exchange reserves are contracting. Stable coin issuance on the XRPL is growing. And XRP just surpassed $92.7 billion in market capitalization, flipping BNB to claim the number 4 spot globally. None of that is noise. Every single one of those data points is structural. The question isn't whether the price of XRP will reflect this infrastructure build-out. The question is who will still be holding a meaningful position when that reflection occurs. The market does not reward those who figured it out after the fact. History does not reward comfort. It rewards those who paid attention when the room was quiet. Let me be clear about what we covered today. Ripple has gone all in on Brazil, payments, custody, treasury, prime brokerage, and a VSB license application with the central bank. MasterCard is acquiring BVNK, a company whose own technical analysis endorses XRP's architecture over SWIFT. The regulatory environment in the United States has structurally shifted, and the math behind a fixed supply, utility-driven token operating at increasing scale across the global payments system is not a speculation. It is a requirement. Price is a distraction. Value is the reality. And the value being built in real time across 60-plus markets, inside the walls of the world's largest financial institutions, on the rails of the XRP ledger. That value is not waiting for permission. The system is being assembled in plain sight. The question is whether you're watching the noise or watching the structure. Stay rational. Stay patient. Stay positioned. Comment signal below if you made it to the end. I want to see who's actually paying attention.